In the dead of winter, a storm trapped a small group of travelers in the Black Oak Inn, a remote, weathered building perched on a snow-covered hill. Among the group was Samuel, a brooding man with a past he wouldn't share, and Beatrice, a young woman with haunted eyes. They huddled by the fireplace, nervously eyeing the inn's walls, which were lined with mirrors of all shapes and sizes. "Strange choice for decor," Samuel muttered, his gaze lingering on a tall mirror opposite him. The mirror seemed to twist his reflection, subtly changing the face, staring back at him, adding shadows beneath his eyes and hollowness to his cheeks. "They say these mirrors show your soul," replied old Marta, the innkeeper, her voice as brittle as her bony hands. "Those who have sinned will find their darkest selves here." The guests laughed nervously, dismissing her as a superstitious relic, but as the storm raged, they noticed something unsettling. Each mirror seemed to shift their reflections, revealing their hidden fears, the darkness they tried to bury. As the night wore on, each guest became increasingly uneasy. Samuel was the first to feel it. The gaze of his own reflection seemed to pierce through him, showing visions of his past. In the mirror, he saw himself standing over a man's lifeless body, blood staining his hands. "You murdered him," the reflection whispered, its mouth twisting into a malicious smile. Samuel recoiled, but the mirror held him captive. He began sweating as he saw the corpse twitch, heard its bones crack and reform, and then, in a horrifying moment, the reflection stepped out of the mirror, pulling itself free with grotesque, popping sounds as its skin ripped from the glass. The other guests screamed as Samuel's reflection reached for him, dragging him toward the mirror. His screams echoed as his body broke, bones snapping in unnatural angles as he was pulled into the glass, his flesh stretching and tearing until his reflection vanished, leaving the mirror stained red. Panic erupted as the guests saw Samuel's contorted form still in the mirror, eyes wide with terror, frozen in a scream. Beatrice backed away, but the mirrors began to close in, revealing her own reflection. She saw herself drenched in blood, her hands twisted into claws, her eyes glowing with feral hunger. "You abandoned them," her reflection hissed, blood dripping from its mouth. "You let them starve." She shook her head, stumbling backward, but the image grew clearer. She saw her own family, gaunt and desperate, reaching out for help she had refused. Guilt clawed at her, and she fell to her knees, sobbing. Her reflection stepped out of the mirror, its skeletal hands reaching for her throat. Beatrice tried to scream, but it was too late. The creature dug its claws into her flesh, tearing through skin and muscle. Blood sprayed across the walls as her throat was ripped open, her life draining onto the floor in thick, dark streams. She collapsed, her eyes staring blankly at her murderer, herself. The remaining guests huddled together, realizing the mirrors demanded blood. Old Marta cackled from the shadows, whispering, "They hunger for sin, for guilt. Those who confess may survive, but those who hide are devoured." One by one they began confessing, begging the mirrors for mercy. Sir Edward admitted to his crimes of betrayal, his voice shaking as he spoke. The mirror across from him rippled, but his reflection held still, watching him with a sneer. But John, a wealthy merchant, refused to confess. He spat at the mirrors, scoffing at the supernatural. "I owe no one my secrets," he shouted, backing away as his reflection glared back with red, bloodshot eyes. In a frenzy, his reflection lunged forward, ripping itself from the glass with wet, tearing sounds. It clawed at him, slashing his skin open, layer by layer. Blood gushed from his wounds as his reflection laughed, pulling him apart with impossible strength. His intestines spilled onto the floor in a tangled, glistening mess, steaming in the cold air until his screams died and his body lay in ruin.
Chapter 5: The Price of Survival. By dawn, only old Marta remained, her face reflected in dozens of mirrors, each showing a different version of herself, young and beautiful, middle-aged and angry, old and triumphant. The inn had claimed its price, feeding on the sins and secrets of those who sought shelter within its walls. She stared into one final mirror, her face calm. I am the keeper of your sins, she whispered to her reflection, watching as her face twisted into a monstrous grin. And I shall feed you until the end of time. The storm passed, and Grimholt's villagers would later find the inn empty, save for the bloodstains on the walls and the shattered mirrors that still bore the faint, bloody traces of those who had been devoured by their own reflections.
The small village of Grimholt lay shrouded in mist as the traveling carnival descended upon it, like a shadow settling over the valley. The townsfolk knew of this carnival. It appeared every 50 years without warning and was filled with sideshows, games, and exhibits stranger than any could imagine. It was said that those who entered often left different. Remember, the elders whispered to the children, don't enter the Hall of Mirrors. But temptation is a powerful force, and when the carnival's lights flickered to life, casting a glow over Grimholt's main square, even the village's warnings felt like distant echoes. Elara, a curious and skeptical young woman, ignored the warnings. She'd always felt like an outsider in Grimholt, her thirst for thrill and adventure setting her apart from the villagers' quiet lives. What's the worst that could happen? She muttered as she stepped toward the brightly colored tent marked Hall of Mirrors. As she entered, she felt a chill roll over her. Inside, mirrors stretched from floor to ceiling, reflecting countless versions of herself. Some looked normal, others slightly distorted, and a few had subtle differences she couldn't place. She walked deeper, her footsteps echoing in the strange silence as the mirrored reflections grew darker. Suddenly, one mirror caught her eye. In it, her face appeared gaunt, her eyes hollow with dark bruises beneath them. The skin was ashen, stretched tight over bone, and her expression, it was a wicked grin she knew she'd never make. "What?" she whispered, transfixed. The reflection spoke back in her voice, low and twisted. "I am your future," it hissed, "the real you." Elara recoiled, but as she tried to move, the mirrors around her shifted, each one revealing different twisted versions of herself. In one, she was covered in blood, laughing as she held a knife. In another, she appeared skeletal, as though starved, her hands outstretched, reaching for something, or someone. Panic surged within her. She turned to flee, but the maze of mirrors seemed to close in, twisting around her as the reflections moved, following her with twisted smiles. She could hear them whispering, urging her deeper into the maze. She stumbled into a clearing at the heart of the maze, where a single massive mirror stood. This one was not like the others. It was ancient, its frame covered in dark rust and intricate carvings. In it, she saw not herself, but something watching her with inhuman eyes. A voice echoed from within the glass. "You are lost," it said, "but I can help you find your way back." "What do you want?" Elara asked, her voice shaking. The voice chuckled darkly. "Simple, a part of you, just a part, and you may leave." Fear clawed at her, but she nodded, desperate to escape. She reached toward the mirror, feeling the chill of the glass as it began to ripple beneath her touch. She felt a pull, a wrenching sensation deep within her chest, as though a part of her soul were being torn away. In the mirror, her reflection began to change, taking on a life of its own. "Thank you," it whispered, stepping out of the glass and into the room. "Now, run." Chapter 4. The Pursuit. Elara fled through the maze as her doppelganger chased her, a monstrous grin spread across its twisted face. Every mirror she passed showed the creature drawing closer, her own face snarling and distorted. Blood dripped from its mouth as it taunted her. "You gave me life, Elara, and now I will take yours." She tripped, falling to the ground as the creature's laughter echoed around her. Her hands were covered in blood from her scraped palms, and when she looked up, she saw her reflection in the floor-length mirror beside her, showing her lying broken and lifeless. "I am you," it said, stepping out of the glass, "and now you are nothing." In a final, desperate attempt to survive, Elara grabbed a shard of broken glass from the ground and slashed at the reflection as it lunged for her. The creature screamed as the shard sliced through it, blood pouring from its wounds, black and viscous. But as it fell, it pulled her close, whispering with a smile, "Even if you kill me, Alara, you will never leave this place, not truly." As the creature dissolved, Ilara's own reflection began to warp, shifting into the twisted, monstrous version she'd fought. She was trapped within the mirror, her face frozen in a scream, condemned to be the next horror waiting for the next curious soul. The Carnival left Grimholt that night, leaving behind an empty tent and a single shattered mirror. No one would speak of it again, but every few decades another story would emerge, of the Hall of Mirrors, where something terrible and hungry waits, showing visitors the darkest parts of themselves before trapping them in glass forever. Chapter 1. The Invitation. Moorgrave Manor stood like a dark citadel on the edge of the moors, its towering spires shadowing the land. Every year, the manor opened its doors for a grand feast, inviting nobles from across the region. Rumors followed the event, whispers of ghostly figures in mirrors and shadows that seemed to follow guests home. Each mirror, they said, did more than just reflect. It held on to something of everyone who gazed into it too long. Among the guests that year was Edwin, a young noble and known skeptic, intrigued by the manor's dark allure. As he entered, he was met by Lady Isadora, who walked with him down the mirror-lined hall, their reflections casting distorted shadows behind them. Edwin remarked on the way the reflections seemed to lag, as though observing rather than mirroring. Lady Isadora grew tense, confiding that local legends claimed the mirrors were inhabited by vengeful spirits, trapped there by the Moorgrave family. The two continued on to the dining hall, where mirrors covered every wall, their ornate frames twisting like serpents. The guests took their seats, casting nervous glances at the glass that seemed to swallow light. Then Lord Moorgrave entered, tall and pale, his dark eyes gleaming as he raised a glass. "To those who witness, and those who will be witnessed," he announced, his reflection flickering strangely as he spoke. As they drank, each guest felt the mirror's gaze upon them, as though their own reflections were studying them, showing faces both familiar and foreign. Chapter 2. The Feast Begins. Dinner commenced with decadent dishes, but a strange unease began to settle over the guests. Reflections twisted subtly, warping the faces in the mirrors with shadows that didn't belong. Edwin noticed that Lord Moorgrave's reflection appeared strangely hollow, his eyes dark pits devoid of life. As the evening progressed, Sir Thomas caught a glimpse of himself in a nearby mirror and staggered back in horror. He described seeing himself impaled on a spit over a roaring fire, his body blackened and smoking. He laughed it off as a trick of the glass, but minutes later, a blood-curdling scream erupted from the kitchen. The guests rushed to the scene to find Sir Thomas's body, skewered and roasting over a fire exactly as he'd described. The metallic smell of burnt flesh filled the air, and gasps of terror replaced the clinking of silverware. Lady Isadora clutched Edwin's arm, trembling as the others tried to make sense of the horror. "The mirrors," Lady Isadora whispered, her voice cracking. "They're showing us our death." The panic grew as more guests began seeing their own grim fates reflected in the mirrors. Lady Isadora's face grew pale when she glimpsed her own body sprawled in a pool of blood, a fatal wound at her temple. Lord Baines saw himself hanging by his neck from a chandelier, his face twisted in agony. Each guest had a moment of grim realization as their visions reflected an undeniable fate. As they scrambled to find an exit, the doors were found to be locked, and the guests felt the walls of the manor closing in. Edwin, struggling to maintain composure, approached Lord Moorgrave, accusing him of orchestrating a cursed ritual. Lord Moorgrave smiled, watching Edwin's expression darken. "We Moorgraves have always served the manor. We feed its hunger," he said. In the mirrors, his reflection grinned wider, almost monstrous, as if relishing the guests' terror. One by one, the guests' fates unraveled as their visions became brutal realities. Lady Isadora, in her panicked flight, slipped on the blood that had begun pooling on the floor, cracking her head against the marble and falling motionless. Her body lay in the exact position she'd seen in her vision. Meanwhile, Lord Baines, desperate to escape, climbed onto the chandelier in a last attempt to reach an open window. The chandelier swayed as he struggled, then snapped, the rope twisting around his neck as he dangled, just as he'd seen himself. Each death left the remaining guests more horrified, feeling trapped as the mirrors seemed to gleam brighter, feeding on the carnage. As dawn approached, Edwin found himself the last guest alive, haunted by visions of his own death that the mirrors displayed with dark delight. Running through the halls, he caught sight after sight of his fate, drowning, strangling, burning, each reflection a cruel, taunting prophecy. In the grand hall he faced the largest mirror of all, set within an ornate, gilded frame. There he saw himself, pale and wide-eyed, his own hands wrapped around his throat. Behind him, Lord Morgrave stood, calm and smiling. "You're a witness, Edwin," Lord Morgrave whispered from the shadows, "and this house demands its witnesses." Edwin's hands, almost beyond his control, rose to his neck. His vision blurred as his reflection squeezed harder, trapping him in the embrace of his own doom. His final scream echoed through the manor, joining the cries of all those who had perished before him. When silence returned, the hall stood empty, but the mirrors held a grotesque gallery of the fallen. Each face stared out, frozen in horror, their souls bound to the Morgrave manor, forever witnesses to the house's insatiable hunger.